Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of Verta Stars Podcast fourth season. How my loyal listeners, thank you for continued support. Enjoy this amazing interview because Daniel Kibblesmith boards the mothership to discuss Darkwing Duck from Dynamite Entertainment. Now come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Kibblesmith. Thank you for coming to Verta Stars Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's totally my pleasure. So I always start off with a question of inspiration to inspire your love for comics and who are your earliest influences.
Great question. Well, I've told this story before, but my inroad to comics was actually through video games. My dad loved comics, especially Marvel comics, and he had a lot of 70s and 80s stuff around, especially X-Men, because that would have been a big deal, at that time. So he took me to the video arcade from time to time, the Fun Zone arcade in Melrose Park, RIP. And they had right by the front door when they got it, they had the six-player wraparound X-Men arcade game,
Hmm.
which, to this day is, probably, top five video games for me ever made. So I was instantly obsessed with these characters and just the way that they really broke the familiar pattern of what superheroes could be outside of Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman and to a lesser extent Spider-Man, the things that I would have been acquainted with from broader pop culture without really being a kid who read comics at that time. And then I was hooked. I think the possibilities of what this held were finally made apparent to me. And yeah, I started reading his collection of like Silver Age Marvel as soon as I got home and never stopped.
So for you as a kid reading Silver Age Marvel, was it Kirby? Was it like who was the artist that you know
Yeah, I
that you
mean,
were
I would say John Buscema was sort
so
of like it was sort of my guy. Like John Buscema was we had a lot of Silver Surfer around as
hmm.
well. And that was a very John Buscema sort of showcase book. So yeah, I think he found a way because my dad's collection, the things that he had to sell a lot of it when he was younger, but the things that he kept, um, John Buscema was sort of threaded through all of it. But also like obviously Kirby and Ditko were huge. My dad didn't have that much old Spider-Man, so I kind of grew
Hmm.
to appreciate Ditko as an adult, but he had a lot of Lee Kirby Fantastic Four. And like virtually any other reader of superhero comics, like those are enormous to me. Really, really changed my understanding and relationship at that age with like storytelling, and
Hmm.
character and scope. So yeah, I go back to those all the time. I reread Lee Kirby Fantastic Four constantly.
Yeah, that's one thing I love about comic books, and also well, for me, baseball is just it's generational. You learn it from your father. Like with me, comics too was my father was a Silver Age fan as well. And he got me into comic books. For me, it was Batman. The '89 Batman movie was the one that got me eventually in it. But yeah, but it's great how comic books just kind of just get passed on from a generation to generation now, and at least in this country.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm a parent now too, and it's really interesting to see, without really wanting to force anything on her or jinx it. It's really interesting to see the way that superhero media enters her life in this really organic
Mm.
way. And right now, I think Sonic the Hedgehog is doing that. I think the kids at school really like Sonic the Hedgehog.
Yeah,
So,
it,
so I'm like, oh, if you like Sonic the Hedgehog, there's this guy called the Flash.
that's awesome.
Gently, 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 gently.
And create that addiction for life. That good comic book addiction where your money just kind of follows through like a drug
Yeah.
habit. But I mean, I love comic books, and it must be something to be a comic book fan and then a comic book and then become a comic book writer. And you're now writing Darkwing Duck, which is one of the great cartoons from the '90s for Dynamite Entertainment. So how do you get involved with Darkwing Duck?
Yeah, I mean, speaking of nostalgia and stuff I loved growing up, I was obviously a big Darkwing Duck fan. I was the right age to be fully cognizant of what it was when it debuted and to be hooked as a fan, just really solidly in that demographic of like kids who were maybe watching like a lot of Ducktales and sort of like Saturday
Mm.
morning cartoons and more comedy focused, but around that time, sort of the big superhero animation wave of my childhood was happening, and it was things that were like on the satirical side that worked as bridges into these, genres like Darkwing Duck, obviously, and maybe The Tick was like
Hmm.
a path to more sophisticated, sort of like grown-up style comedy. And then pure superhero stuff like Batman the Animated Series, obviously one of the greatest TV shows ever made, and X-Men, and then Spider-Man. So Darkwing was really the center of this world for me. It was everything that I already knew I liked, and everything that I was just really starting to understand and be obsessed with. And I think it's such a great path for teaching anybody who wants to get into superheroes, like the language of that world, from the catchphrases and the designs, but also the tone and the sort of like warmth and secret identity elements that I think people who don't read comic books are surprised to find out how much humanity is in the superheroes once they start. So and the rogues gallery, of course,
Hmm.
which I would hold up against any rogues gallery in comics.
Now, the big controversy with Darkwing Duck, and we're gonna get your input on it. Is it in the same universe as DuckTales?
So I try not to ask because it seems like a very fraught question. Here's what I know. Here's what I know. I was just talking about this with a friend this morning because they asked me to. My understanding is that it's two different launch pads.
Okay.
I
Okay.
don't fully understand how or why it's two different launch pads, but I've been told that it's two different launch pads. That being said, there's not only a Darkwing Duck universe and a DuckTales universe, there's also like a Darkwing Duck's comics universe and a DuckTales comics universe, and then multiple DuckTales and Darkwing Duck comics universes. And then there's the new DuckTales that also has its own Darkwing Duck, but they're definitely in the same universe and it is the same launchpad. So the short answer is nobody knows.
All right, I'm saying it's a little hot take, a little bit of a hot take, but I appreciate it. And now the other interesting, as you mentioned about universes, right? So you're running Darkwing Duck for Dynamite. Obviously, we just came out of Amanda Dybert had a Darkwing Duck run. Roger Langridge had the Justice Ducks run, and I just blanked on the one who wrote Mega Duck. Can't remember.
Jeff Kirker, right?
Yes, thank you so much, Jeff Parker. Um, so and because I mean, it's Darkwing Duck, so I mean, continuity kind of matters, kind of doesn't matter, sort of. I mean, where does your series exist within now the Dynamite Duck verse?
Yeah, the Dynamite Duck first. Let's call it. That's good. You just coined that.
Thank you.
So I am not incorporating anything from the previous Dynamite run. I read it, obviously. I read everything I could get my hands on, and some of them are really hard to find. Shout outs to Interlibrary Loan. If you don't know this, your library, if they don't have something, they will try to get it to you from another library system, which is an incredible generosity and something you're already paying for. So I always tell people to get comics from the library, which I do constantly. So I read all of the Darkwing Duck comics that I could get my hands on, and what I notice about them is that they all, very intuitively start writing Darkwing Duck stories like it's a comic book. So you immediately get these like serialized four-parters or six-parters that sort of reimagine Darkwing as a comic book superhero and then start building those kinds of stories around him, where, issue two really leads into issue three, into issue four. So, given that that had already been done, and that this was sort of my inclination anyway, we went the opposite, where our Darkwing series is very lightly serialized. It's about Darkwing Duck writing his autobiography and trying to complete his autobiography by finding the villain that will become his archenemy. So every time he fights a villain, he is either, openly or, unconsciously auditioning them to be his archenemy. But other than that sort of, very loose through line, we're making these comics like episodes of the TV show.
Hmm.
Issue one is Megavolt. Issue two is Bushroot. If you miss issue one and pick up issue two, it's a brand new story, and we're doing that one because that's how it felt to watch the TV show, and I envision these as lost episodes of the TV show. We compared a lot to Untold Tales of Spider-Man.
Hmm.
Something that, if it feels right, it could slot, right into the thing that you already love. And two, because I imagine a lot of these comics will be read by kids. And I love like confusing comics for kids. Like I don't believe that jumping on points are that important. I think that you can read like the most confusing 90s X-Men comic and fall in love with X-Men because it happened so much. There's a lot of evidence that works.
Yeah.
But with really little kids, or maybe if you're reading something like with your parents and they might not be big comic book readers, I also like giving them the opportunity to just have a one and done story
Hmm.
that can be 30 minutes of comedy and adventure away from screens, something families can enjoy together, something that, grown-ups can enjoy themselves if they like jokes and are nostalgic for Darkwing Duck.
I was just gonna say because as someone who just I grew up in the '90s, um, I will say I did buy the Amanda Diver's Darkwing Duck, and I do buy the Justice Ducks. And while I'm probably way too old to be buying them, there's something fun about for 15, 20 minutes being like, you know what, I'm just gonna enjoy life right now. I don't need anything dark and brooding and depressing. I'm just gonna watch some silly ass Darkwing Duck comedy and and hear him say his famous lines. I'm the terror and just enjoy my life for 20
Yeah,
minutes.
that's where we're going for. I mean, I don't think you're ever too old to read Darkwing Duck, especially in the context you're describing, because, I don't know about you, but when I go to the comic book store, I don't buy one comic book,
Right.
I buy 11, right? So, in between my various genres and characters and properties and tones, you always have room for something fun,
Right.
something kind of like comfort food.
I agree 100%. I mean, obviously, there's your Hellblazer Constantine time. Sometimes you're in the mood for that.
Sure.
But
For
then,
instance.
you come home from work, you're not going to dive into Hell and Constantine. You're going to want to read Darkwing
Yeah.
Duck, and for 20 minutes, be like, okay, I'm 15.
That
Or,
would be a fun crossover, though. I would definitely do that
I
crossover.
could see DC doing that at some point, just because it would be so funny. And I think the interesting too when you're writing Darkwing Duck, he's also famously voiced by Jim Cummings. As someone who does some writing myself, I do know when you write a character, you kind of hear your own voice, but someone as iconic as Darkwing Duck, are you hearing Jim Cummings' voice or are you hearing your voice when you're writing?
In with this project, I
Yeah.
hear the cast. With this project, I hear the '90s cast for sure. Because the reason that I pursued this all got started because I sent a DM to the editor when Negaduck got announced, and I said, "Hey, I'd love to do a one shot. Darkwing Duck is really important to me. I'd love to do a one shot or a backup story or
Hmm.
whatever is available." And he said, "We don't have anything small right now. We're relaunching the title. Would you like to do that?" And of course, the answer is yes. So here we are. So with Darkwing, whenever you're writing a famous character, I've written for like the example I always use is I wrote Black Panther versus Deadpool.
Hmm.
And with them, I have a relationship with those characters that predates the movie. So I know from a literary perspective, I know what their voice sounds like, and
Hmm.
I know what those two characters will do when you put both of them in a room and let them bounce off of each other. Like it feels familiar to me, and I can let the characters guide a lot of the storytelling. But with Darkwing, I literally hear their voices
Hmm.
because it's animation. I grew up with it, and it's just, especially the big three, Darkwing, Launchpad, Goslin, and I would throw Dan Castellaneta as Megavolt in there as well. I mean, they're just iconic right out of the gate. So yeah, they're so burned into my brain that I try to have very little of me in there. I'm just, what would an episode of the show be like if I was working on it right now? And that's always the goal, is to kind of to disappear into this thing that I care about and that I'm really trying to serve.
Now, the one thing interesting, because you mentioned like runs, like Dynamite, right?
Mhm.
Darkwing Duck, the Amanda Dybart one, I think made it 10 issues. Negaduck, I think Negaduck made it to maybe 8. Justice Ducks was 5. When we're talking about a run of for Darkwing Duck, do they have like is this something we can look forward to for, a long time to come? Is this something that's kind of they'll do like a like the shorter run, but then they, move on and relaunch again. I mean, what kind of how far ahead can we look forward to?
So the short answer to this question is always buy it. You know what I mean? So like if you're enjoying it and you keep buying it, they have no choice but to keep making more. And I would love to keep making more. I know that this is slated to be like what for me is a long run. But I think there's always like the possibility of a renewal of some kind, or a spin-off of some kind if it's a big hit. The business has changed a lot, and people do sort of like putting out miniseries and maxi series rather than trying to go for infinity issues
Hmm.
and petering out like around number 37 or something. But personally, I am a big fan of that model.
Hmm.
So I know how many I'm booked for. But I believe that if people keep buying this thing, that number could change, and we would have the honor of petering out around issue 37.
Well, I'm one of those, but I mean, I'm an old school comic book fan. When there was something cool about seeing Batman number 800 and blah blah blah. I mean, and as someone who was again started buying comics in the late 80s, early 90s, I wasn't buying when I bought Fantastic Four, it was on 317. It didn't matter that I missed the other 316 issues. It's comic books. You pick it up. I mean, after an issue, maybe an issue of two, you'll figure it out. I mean, this it's not like, Shakespeare where you're just like deep, have to figure out the, every little ins and figure out what's, it's comic books. You can enjoy it and jump in, and first you enjoy it, then second you figure it out.
Yeah,
It kind of
totally
how it
agree.
goes.
I think
Um,
that's one of the reasons so many comic book fans also love wrestling.
yeah,
My friends who do the War Rocket Ajax podcast, they always say you don't catch up on wrestling. You
yeah.
just start, and if you stay with it, eventually you know as much as anybody else.
Right. I agree with you 100%. Now, as a comic book fan, obviously, Darkwing Duck's big line is, "I am the terror who flaps in the night," and then he says something, he ad-libs something after that that kind of relates a little bit to what's going on. Um, Now, as a Darkwing Duck fan, that has to be one of the most fun parts to write because that is the iconic moment for Darkwing Duck. Now, how are you put pieces that together? Are you looking at this what's happening at the moment and going and working backwards? Do you think of like a cool line in your head randomly, try to figure out how to fit it in? How do you do that line?
It's actually really hard because there have been so many. I was able to find a list online of all of the ones that have been used in the television show, and
Yeah.
sometimes I think of one, and I go to the list, and it's been done already. So, so I used to work for a talk show, the Stephen Colbert Show,
Okay.
and one of the things we had to do were a lot of like refillable segments. So I had a very similar gig where I always had to write I didn't have to, but I got very good at writing the intros to a segment called Meanwhile that he
Okay.
does at the desk. And it was very similar because what you're doing is finding like a new jokey way of, describing like some phenomenon in the world that like Darkwing Duck, as a character when he wakes up every day, he needs to come up with two or three like scourges. I'm the thing that falls into your thing when you do the thing.
Right.
He has to have a bunch of those in his pocket, and now I do too. So it's a huge honor to
Yeah.
get to do those, but the hardest part is coming up with new ones.
I don't think I like the picture of him just waking up and going, before I go out in superhero, I need a couple of cool lines to come up with before I go out there.
But he's also Darkwing Duck, so he probably wings it, pun sort of intended.
Now the other hard part with writing Darkwing Duck or Drake Mallard, is that he part of me. I mean, obviously he's a fun character, but there's a tightrope on some level where he's arrogant, narcissistic, but you also got to be a lovable family man as well. That's a weird balance. You usually don't think narcissist, good father, father. You know what I'm saying? So I mean, how do you walk that it makes sense that he can be both people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the premise of the show, that is sort of like the tension that is at the heart of the show and what makes it, a story, a
Hmm.
story with inner conflict. Like if you go back and watch the pilot, the two-part pilot, it is a show about a guy who has decided to become a superhero. And we don't really know why. He's assured of his own greatness. He's pretty good at it.
Hmm.
He makes a lot of mistakes and there's a lot of slapstick, but part of the charm of Darkwing Duck is that he sort of like bobs in and out of extreme competence.
Yeah.
And then he meets Goslin and Launchpad. And now he goes from protecting the city in an abstract sense to having people in his life to protect,
Hmm.
and who also save him constantly, like also protect him from his own overconfidence. So I think that's the thing that makes him a three-dimensional character instead of a two or one-dimensional character, is that Darkwing Duck without Launchpad and Goslin isn't really a show.
Hmm.
It's just a guy who has found his thing, doing it on repeat. But because he needs to balance something that he cares about, because he has something to lose and something to aspire to, I think that's what fleshes out the character and makes us love him and care about his success.
Now, when you're thinking about what makes him happy, is he happier saving the citizens, or is he happy being fighting villains and being famous? Like where would the actual happiness come from?
It's funny because he doesn't do a lot of saving citizens. Saving the citizens in the Darkwing Duck show, saving the citizens is a bit of an abstract kind of tertiary
Yeah.
role. He mostly catches the bad guys. So it's hard to say what brings him the most satisfaction, but the thing you see him doing the most is defeating the villains, outsmarting them in some clever way. It's very rarely like strictly a fight. Darkwing Duck usually, in the matter of maybe like Adam West Batman. Like there's always the fighting part of Adam West Batman with the pow, Biff and
Yeah.
stuff. But there's an equal amount of like solving puzzles, like escaping from death traps and things like that. And Darkwing Duck, across mediums, really embraces and works hard at making Darkwing clever and good at his job. So I think he always has the self-satisfaction of like, that's it. Here's what we do.
Hmm.
And pulling it off at the exactly the 22-minute mark.
Now, for when you think of Darkwing Duck, he's writing his autobiography. You're saying, in your series, I imagine he's not the most reliable narrator. Um,
Correct.
it's kind of funny talking about Darkwing Duck in terms of the what's real, because I mean it's a cartoon character, but
Of
I mean
course.
how it's a story about a guy writing a story about himself, so it's like a cartoon guy writing a cartoon. So how much of the story, like how do you are you writing a story thinking it's gotta be clear what's happening, but at the same time you definitely have a bias Darkwing Duck who's telling the story in a way that isn't properly how it really happened, especially when you talk about as well slapstick. How much
Mhm.
is that he would he even be allowed? Would he be willing to share how he screws up, and that humor is there as well?
Right. No, you're right. I mean, we've been working on this for well over a year now, and the inception layers are only now starting to become like apparent to me that this is a cartoon show turned comic book where the central character is writing his autobiography that you may or may not be reading. And the cartoon played with this exact same unreliable narrator tension as well, where he's got conflicting origin stories.
Hmm.
Sometimes he's growing up with Megavolts and they go to high school together, and other times he's from a parody of Krypton, and his dad is Jim Cummings doing a Marlon Brando impression. So that's been there since the beginning, and we're just really trying to embrace it. I don't think about it much. I think my priority is just doing a really great Darkwing Duck story, and he's already so assured of his own greatness while still like visibly like being a buffoon a lot of the time that I don't see him as really like concealing any information. I think it is what it is. And with our primary goal just like telling new Darkwing Duck stories that feel like the TV show, I wouldn't want to get too thinky. I wouldn't want to get too complicated. But what I will say is that every few issues, I don't know if this is a secret. Every few issues, we get a chapter that's strictly from the autobiography, and it's a chapter that is supposedly from Darkwing Duck's past. So we get kind of a, an untold chapter from the autobiography of Darkwing Duck.
Did
And
you?
those are strictly what you're describing. They are stories about him, told by him, that may or may not be true.
Are we gonna find out what he actually does for a living to afford his lavish lifestyle that he must
Well, I
have?
know what he does for a living. He's Darkwing Duck.
I mean,
That's the job.
well, I mean, where the money came from that is fueling. I mean, he had to had a day job at some
Right, right.
point.
That is not something. Here's what I'll say. That's not something I want to know
Okay,
as a fan. So it's not something that I would try to like force any like logic onto.
fair enough, fair enough. So what can our listeners look forward to in upcoming issues of Darkwing Duck?
Every villain that you love, every Darkwing Duck villain that you love is going to be in there. Maybe with one big exception, then you can maybe guess who the big exception is. But if we keep making the comics, then we'll get to them. It's going to feel as much like the show as we can muster, and a lot of that comes from having access to Tad Stones, the creator, who obviously we've been in communication with, and who's doing our A covers, and making sure that that this feels right, because we're all very much coming from this place of like we grew up with this, we understand this inside and out, we've internalized these voices, and now the trick is just getting it on the page. So what I like to say is that this is as close to new or lost episodes of Darkwing Duck as you are likely to get in the near future. They keep trying with animation. They keep trying, but this is a little easier to just make a comic book because there's a lot less money and obstacles to getting this on your desk. So yeah, if you're as big a fan as we are, that's the goal. That's the job.
Well, like I said, I want to thank you so much for doing it because, like I said, long time Darkwing Duck fan, so I love the nostalgia factor, and it's just fun to read a fun comic book. So thank you so much, Mr. Kibblesmith. Absolute honor to speak with you, sir.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a very good night.